Think we will go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for coming here today. We have quite a crowd here, which is really exciting. And I first want to introduce myself. My name is Phil Warsaw. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University. And for those of you who maybe aren't that familiar with the USSEE, just as a quick introduction, the United States Society for Ecological Economics is a society that provides a venue for intellectual exchange and collaborations on issues related to theory, policy, and implementation of sustainable development. Our society consists of an interdisciplinary group of academics and practitioners who seek to develop solutions to complex and interrelated economic, social, and environmental problems. So despite the name economics being in our title, we are a mix of both economists and many non-economists, for those of you who are maybe a little bit scared by that word. Our motto in many ways is transforming the economy for a just and sustainable world. And I think that's well represented in the panel that we're going to be hosting today, as well as the overarching theme of this webinar series this year, which is the post-COVID economy, centering justice and sustaining ecosystems. And before we move on, I will just note that I'm sure one of our board members will be dropping a link to our society in the chat for those who want to learn more about us and what we do. We always want to encourage more people to join us so that we can continue to expand and grow and do more productive work, and particularly in these trying times. So to lay the foundation a little bit for why we wanted to focus on sustainable agriculture as for our second webinar, the COVID-19 pandemic has obviously shown many of the weaknesses that we have within our economic systems. And one of the ways in which we've seen this, which maybe has received sporadic attention throughout the year, is across our food system. I'm sure many of us, particularly those of us living in the US, remember the early months of lockdowns when grocery stores had empty shelves in many cases, whether it be toilet paper or many meat products. These images were juxtaposed with farmers who literally couldn't get their products off the farms and were oftentimes forced to trash products, whether they be livestock or crops that they were growing, simply because the established supply chain simply broke down due to a slowdown in economic activity. These images were even more juxtaposed against the lines that we saw at many food banks across the country, lines which continue to exist as many people have gone without food. And all of these impacts have been felt acutely by both people of color and indigenous populations, both within the United States and globally. We know that not only from the perspective of food security, but also more broadly, many people of color have been directly impacted or have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And much of this relates to the ways in which our work structures are set up. Many of the early sites of COVID-19 breakouts were in meat processing plants across the Midwest, which employ a disproportionate amount of Latinx workers, particularly migrant workers, whose working conditions were amplified by a lack of meaningful control over their workplaces. In addition, many of our frontline workers, particularly in grocery stores and many restaurants, were also people of color, which disproportionately exposed them directly to COVID-19, which is in part reflected in the disproportionate rates and morbidity rates of COVID-19. And so for us as a board, we saw this as a unique intersection between, on the one hand, economic policy and economic theory more broadly, and the manifestations on the ground, both from an ecological perspective and also from a social perspective. And so this webinar, in essence, is a way for us to try to bridge those gaps, because while this is something that's been reported on within our field, we haven't seen quite as much discussion as we think there could be about the potential intersections between ecological economics and sustainable agriculture. So this webinar is in many ways an attempt to try to bridge that gap. So without any further ado, I will get to the presenters who are going to be joining me for our discussion today. I'll start by introducing Liz Carlisle, who is an assistant professor in the environmental studies program at UC Santa Barbara. Her research and teaching is dedicated to fostering a more just and sustainable food system with a specific focus on agroecological transition in the US. Born and raised in Montana, she got hooked on sustainable agriculture while working as an aide to organic farmer and US Senator John Tester, which led to a decade of research and writing collaborations with agroecological farmers in her home state. She is the author of the book Lentil Underground and a co-author with Bob Quinn of the book Grain by Grain, and she has written both popular and academic articles about food and farm policy, incentivizing soil health practices, and supporting new entry farmers. Our second panelist is Alby Miles, who's an assistant professor of sustainable community food systems at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. Dr. Miles received his PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley in 2013. His natural science research explores the relationship between farming system biodiversity and the provisioning of ecosystem services to and from agriculture. His social science research explores the socioeconomic and political obstacles to achieving ecologically sustainable and socially just food and farming systems. He has worked at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems at UC Santa Cruz. Our last panelist is Kamuela Enos, who is the director of the newly created Office of Indigenous Innovation for the Office of Vice President for Research and Innovation at the University of Hawaii. Before taking this position, he worked for 11 years at the Ma'au Organic Farm, where he served as their director of social enterprise. He was born and raised in Waianae on the island of Oahu. He received a bachelor's degree in Hawaiian studies and a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He sits on the boards of numerous community-based nonprofits and was a commissioner on President Obama's White House initiative on Asian and Pacific Islanders. So welcome to all of you. And I want to start this panel by giving you a chance to talk a little bit about your work. And from a 1,000-foot view, to tell us a bit about how you're viewing food systems in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and its related crises. So maybe let's start with Liz, if you want to just tell us, if you want to spend a few minutes talking about your work.
Well, thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction, Phil, and for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited for this conversation. I think it's really timely. And I'm excited to be here also with a bunch of really incredible undergraduates from UCSB who are joining me here for the discussion. So we'll continue to follow up on these ideas throughout the quarter, which is awesome too. The 1,000-foot view of my work is really having conversations with people in food and agriculture, with farmers and ranchers and communities about their transitions to agroecological systems, both in terms of their own farming systems, but also how they want to be part of more broadly agroecological food systems. And in those conversations, in those interviews, really trying to understand both the barriers that food producers face in moving towards more agroecological systems, but then also what kinds of opportunities and possibilities they see for those transitions. And so, as far as, I guess methods, I'm a qualitative researcher and a narrative nonfiction writer. And, along with Albie and some other colleagues, have also been really interested in getting engaged in policy work. So I'm interested both in learning about what these narratives and structures are that are shaping possibilities for a more agroecological food system. And I'm also interested in getting actively involved in helping to co-create the narratives and structures that really do facilitate more of these agroecological transitions. And I think that this moment of the COVID pandemic, and I guess, a series of related pandemics that we're seeing, racial injustice, climate change, all of these intersections of pandemics I like the phrasing of pandemic as portal. I like the idea that perhaps, this is a moment for transformative change. Certainly, we've seen a lot of structures disrupted. And I think what that means to me is that if we're going to rebuild the systems that we have, that would have to be an intentional choice. And that would be, I think, a really tragic and cynical choice. So we have another choice, which is to rebuild these systems differently. And in some really material ways, we see this $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. There's an infrastructure bill on the table as far as federal legislation. There really is an opportunity to kind of build the guts of the food system differently.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liz. And so I'll pass this on now to Albie.
Hi, everyone. Alby Miles, again, Assistant Professor, Sustainable Community Food Systems at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. And by way of introduction, I work at a small liberal arts college on the west side of Oahu. The college was really designed to serve the Native Hawaiian community of Hawaii on the west side of Oahu. And my program, Sustainable Community Food Systems, was really developed in close collaboration with Native Hawaiian leaders like Kamuela Enos and the former organization that he worked with. The program itself is really transdisciplinary in nature. It's an undergraduate degree program exclusively, and it was designed to really help young people understand the food and agricultural system from a transdisciplinary perspective, integrating natural sciences, social sciences, and the humanities, and including traditional ecological knowledge. So we want to try to help young people, Native Hawaiian and others, understand this complex socio-ecological system from this multi or transdisciplinary perspective. So my primary work is in education, working with undergraduate students, but I also do research on different aspects of the food and agricultural system. Historically, it's been focusing on diversified farming systems. That's really where I met Liz, and we published some work on diversified farming systems and obstacles and opportunities for farming systems change. But recently, my work has been increasingly focusing on food system resilience and equity. And one element of that work is working with a group of community leaders here in Hawaii. And we've launched a project called Transforming Hawaii's Food Systems Together. And that is really intended as a kind of a regional planning approach that involves research and the development of planning documents that will help facilitate elements of Hawaii's food system in supporting our achieving of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so that's a little bit about my work in terms of looking at the food system from the vantage of COVID-19. A couple things I'll mention. I think that it's important to understand that COVID-19 is a food system issue. We tend not to reflect on it as a food system issue, but like SARS and like Ebola and like many other virulent pathogens, these are food system issues. And it's a significant ecological, social, economic externality of the ways we are producing food that we need to take into consideration. I think it also, COVID-19 exposed a set of systemic vulnerabilities, particularly for people with limited purchasing power, or people who are in a low income status. And it also, I think, laid bare the kind of ongoing issue that is faced in higher education around solving for the problem of hunger, malnutrition, and food insecurity by increasing agricultural productivity, as opposed to enhancing the purchasing power of low income and poor communities. And so I think that COVID-19 really exposed that food insecurity is really an issue of economic purchasing power. And then I think the last thing I would say is that it's important to understand the shock to the system, I think, really got people's attention in terms of the series, not only of COVID-19, but the fires in California, the various kind of indicators of a destabilizing climate, that we need to begin this process of concerted efforts toward food system resilience and equity planning. So I'll pause there. Thank you. You're on mute, Phil.
Thank you, Albie. And I'll go ahead and pass this along to Kamu.
Aloha, aloha mai kako pakahea pau, Kamuela Enos, the current and first director of the brand spanking new Office of Indigenous Innovation for the Office of Research and Innovation for University of Hawaii System. I think the question is really important. It really provides an opportunity to affirm what Native people have been saying for a long time, is that when you, so much of our systems ancestrally were optimized for Native Hawaiians, especially were optimized for sustainable agriculture, an entire society that allowed us to live on the most finite biosystem on the face of the earth, really optimized for bequeathing abundance to the next generation. And the measures, our spirituality, our policies, our economics, everything was about how to retain what are the metrics of a healthy biosystem that produces food, and what are metrics of healthy people that are engaging in that system. So, you know, the opportunity that we've always understood in our community I was raised in, and the legacy of activism I'm a part of, was we have thousands of years of R&D on how to live within an island. And the opportunity afforded us was to learn the systems that were thrust upon us, to become excellent within them, but to have these systems be vehicles for ancestral responsibilities anew. So this idea of restoring agency to the people of the place to then engage in contemporary systems, but not in a way that they become complicit by helping contemporary systems, but they can eventually get to the space where we can get to the control room and turn the direction of the boat, because we have the PhDs, because we're able to create the business models, because we're able to create the curriculum that the contemporary society understands is really what we're showing up to do. We created the Office of Indigenous Innovation as a partnership with the University of Hawaii, with the vision of Vice President Vasilis Sermos, who kind of understood the opportunity, the Director of Sustainability for Your System, Matt Lynch, and a partner, a consortium of Native Hawaiian organizations at the table at its inception, including Ma'o Farms, the Purple Ma'o Foundation, and a large native land trust, native trust called Kamehameha Schools. And what we've been able to do with this office is to resituate the idea of ancestral practice as innovation, and leveraging the fact that there are groups within Hawaii that have cultivated a dual fluency of not just knowing how to participate in contemporary society, but to use their ancestral systems to hit contemporary metrics. And this being situated within the Office of Research and Innovation allows us to be able to have a national platform to talk about this work, to bring research into, resources into the university to then channel through our faculty, staff, and students who are kind of in the space of trying to figure this out, with Albie an example. And then to create scalable prototypes that really understand that the symptoms we're seeing of climate change, of COVID and these other things, are symptoms of a fracturing between people's relationship with landscapes. And the ways to heal them have to be rooted in ancestral principles, but make sense for contemporary societies. They have to live in spaces where people are employed and they get meaningful education and they have access to healthy food. So I'm going to drop in the chat before this is done a really quick video that was done by Al Jazeera on Ma'o Farms, where I came from, which I think is a great primer, because you hear me talking about the space, but I can't talk about something without it having context. So I'll drop it in the chat, and if you have time, you can watch it later, because it provides an overview of where I came and context of what I'm doing now within the Office of Research.
Thank you for that. And I think that response really acts as a great transition to the next question that I want to ask, which is, when we think about this moment and we think about what the pandemic has exposed, another sort of crisis that has become emergent in the same last year is the ongoing struggle for racial justice, for justice for many of the indigenous peoples in this country and abroad. And we've seen through the uprisings, through the uprisings after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, this ongoing conversation about how we use this moment to really rethink how our systems operate to either the advancement or the detriment of racial justice. And recently, we've seen some conversation about this starting to emerge in small corners within the food system, at least at that policy level, with the recent conversations around the 1.9 trillion recovery plan that Liz mentioned, and the money going specifically the money being that's targeted towards supporting farmers of color. And so I'm wondering if you all could speak a little bit about why is this needed, right? So why are we having this conversation about needing to support BIPOC farmers in this moment? And I'll just open that up to anyone, for anyone to jump in.
Take a whack real fast first. I think it's important when you talk about the POC that you disaggregate that term, because I think there's layers. I think there are within that construct people who were forcibly brought to America to help build out America as a system, and there were people that were here already. And I think I can only speak on the perspective of indigenous, why investing in indigenous models makes sense. But I think the term I want to put out to encapsulate both is the idea of equity, and why you would invest in Native Hawaiians reclaiming our farm. Well, first is a practical act that we didn't acquiesce to having been kicked off our farms in the first place. So how do we have an opportunity to reclaim it? But when we lost, the second part though is really valuable, and it moves past acknowledging the grievance of what has happened to the opportunity, is the ancestral models of growing food represent a corpus of knowledge that is deeply attuned to how do you live within an island. And the work of contemporary communities like Ma'o Farms, which I dropped in the chat, to translate that benefits not just Native Hawaiians, it benefits everybody. And it really situates the communities back, moving from being impoverished back to agency. And when you move a community that's currently impoverished back into a space of agency and the reclamation of our food systems, you begin to see a broad array of outcomes around it, of positive metrics that everyone wants to see, including not just the production of food, but spaces of education, spaces of employment, spaces of health. The United States so that's one of the things.
Sorry, Kamu, I think someone else. Sophia, could you mute your mic, please? Or Albie, are you able to mute her mic, please? Sorry, Kamu.
No problem. So that, I mean, in a nutshell, it's about equity. And there's something Albie has said a lot that I think is important, is that when you get food systems right, you get everything right. And in Hawaiian, the word to eat kind of means to rule. And we based our entire practice on that. So the restoration creates a really broad array of potential opportunities for everyone to benefit from. But this is only speaking from the indigenous perspective, so I don't want to speak on others.
Liz, you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate that, Kamu. I'm just kind of digesting a little bit of that here before thinking about what to say. I think two perspectives that have been really helpful for me, the concept of frontline communities coming out of the environmental justice movement, and relatedly, Black feminism's articulation that, when we are free, everyone is free. And I think both of those really point me to people who are on the front lines of what's wrong with the food system and the harms of the food system, best understand what those problems are and also best understand what those solutions are. And I completely agree with what Kamu is saying about the key role of Indigenous communities, as well as the key role of people who are carrying Indigenous and ancestral traditions, even in the wake of colonization or up against colonization, continuing to carry those in migration. And I think for me, when I look at the issues with the food system and the issue of climate change, ultimately, I think the root causes are in colonization and imbalance that happen with colonization. And so people on the front lines of colonization, I think, can really see in a really deep way those intersections among of care, those intersections of the care that is needed for land to be well, for humans to be well, for all of the other beings that are part of our food systems to be well. And I think that centering the leadership of those communities on the front lines is important for equity reasons, number one. But I think also, I agree with what Kamu said, I think it benefits everyone. I think this is the leadership that we need to meet the moment that we're in.
I'll take that on this question in the following way. I think you're speaking to what I think you referenced as kind of cracks or key points of vulnerability or systemic injustices in the food system. And I'm new to Hawaii. I moved here only 7 years ago, and I'm learning a lot about the history of Hawaii. And I think one of the things that I've learned that I think is deeply disturbing to me and speaks to inequalities in the food system, not just in Hawaii, but more broadly, is that Native Hawaiian people experience much higher rates of chronic illness and food insecurity than the state average in their ancestral homeland. In their ancestral homeland, as Kamu pointed out, that was stolen from them in an illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. And so through that process, as I think Liz mentioned, colonial occupation, dispossession, economic marginalization, lack of economic opportunities had socially constructed a system of low income or poverty. And that has then limited access to quality food, traditional foods, and that is being manifested in the bodies of Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Island people. And that pattern that you see in Hawaii, of course, is not unique to the people of Hawaii. You see that same pattern of high rates of chronic illness in many low-income communities of color who've been on the receiving end of colonial occupation, dispossession, structural oppression. And so I think that what we see in terms of the history of Hawaii, and this is that I try to help my students understand, are patterns that we see across the world. And I think if I was to recommend one reading to help us understand systemic vulnerabilities, I think Philip McMichael's piece that he wrote as a historical analysis of the 2007 and 2008 food crisis helped us understand how a series of historical events has contributed to profound structural vulnerabilities for certain people in society. And unless we rectify those structural inequities, then as crises occur, and whether they're economic or biophysical shocks, then certain people who are on the receiving end of structural oppression, they're the ones who are going to exhibit either ill health or food insecurity or true malnutrition and hunger. So I think that that's an important kind of parallel in my work in Hawaii, is coming to understand the history of Hawaii and how economic marginalization, food insecurity, malnutrition, and chronic illness was socially constructed. And that's a parallel that we see in low-income communities in the continent and various places around the world. And I think I'll just say this very briefly, I think it's important to understand that the underlying values is one of a moral hierarchy. We exist in a caste society. where some people have greater moral value than others. And that caste society, defined by the dominant class, has created circumstances in which people are undervalued or devalued. And then that intersects with the capitalist system that then takes advantage of that hierarchy and exploits those people who are at the lower rungs of the caste system. And as Liz mentioned out, that hierarchy actually extends to not just human beings, but non-human beings and the rest of the natural world. And so the capitalist system, I think, takes advantage of this hierarchy that human beings have created, and we engage in the exploitation of human beings and natural ecosystems that are at the low end of that value hierarchy. And that's now starting to manifest itself in disease and degradation of life's support systems. So I'll pause there.
All really great points. And I think what I want to do now is sort of go from this to talking a little bit about what this means for maybe those of us in our audience who have more of an economics background. And I think one of the ways in which I see all of these ideas that you're talking about, whether it be who has agency within the food system, this idea of a moral hierarchy, is many of these ideas are sort of wrapped up in the ways in which we present economics, often as this sort of neutral science, but with these ideas that are clearly embedded within them. And when we think about the ways people often learn about economics in the classroom, supply and demand, maximizing profits, things along those lines, it's presented as this sort of neutral and obvious, these obvious truths about humanity, right? But underlying that is this idea of perpetual scarcity, of nonstop competition between individuals, between firms, et cetera, which then lead to some of the dynamics that we're currently seeing within our food system. So the growing consolidation among firms like Monsanto and DuPont, the rapid expansion of industrialized farming practices in an effort to maximize efficiency in crop yields, et cetera. And so what I'm wondering now is if you can talk a little bit about how you see this idea of scarcity being manifest in either the communities you work with or in just your work in general, and how that impacts some of the communities that you're working with.
I can take a whack at that, maybe. One of the things I think is really important, and I think Hawaii is not unique, but Hawaii has a real responsibility, because I think of all the native peoples, and I could be totally wrong, ours were probably some of the last in the American experience to be colonized. So it is kind of within living memory, and it's embedded within the landscape of our practice. And I was my background, I was raised by an activist father who reclaimed traditional agrarian, the system that we use to grow our staple crop, kalo, was grown in terraces, and they're called lo'i. And they were basically the central part of how our ancestral systems were designed. Hawaiians were not only self-sufficient on islands, we're self-sufficient in our own valleys. So each valley was designed to be a closed loop system. So part of what my upbringing in activism that was rooted in bringing water back and building people out was I had access to a whole different corpus of knowledge that was different from what is being taught in classrooms. And Einstein, I think, says that the mindset that created a problem can't be the one that tries to create the solution. So this infusion of indigenous systems into contemporary dialogues has us understand that there's not one way to talk about economics. And the important thing that I learned from being in our ancestral space is ask the dangerous question: what does your economy optimize for? And if you ask the people and then you forced us to go to college so we can read spreadsheets now, and we learned your shit, we can start to point out, no, you're saying this and your budget for your PR firm is telling everybody this, but you're optimizing for a smaller cabal of folks getting wealthier at the expense of everybody else. You shouldn't have sent us to college if that's what you made us smart. We learned the system. So the opportunity though is to treat that as the bullshit that you turn into fertilizer. That's what you learn to do on a farm. You turn bullshit into fertilizer. Space for things to grow out of it. And the opportunity, because the system is not working and it's very explicit, we cannot just be in the space of creating indictments around it. We have to see it as a vehicle to bring in our systems that we had. And we can say very clearly, because the incredible research of Native Hawaiian academics, as well as the living landscape around us, our systems optimized for abundance. And in pre-contact Hawaii, the role of the chiefs was to provide abundance for people. And we have beautiful stories of how we love our chiefs to do that, and other beautiful stories about how we killed them when they didn't. So we used this idea of abundance creation as what we optimize for as the basis. I want to be in a space where you can talk about, use Latin to describe science, use Hawaiian to describe environmentalism. The landscape and the language that the landscape taught us, is every single part of it was optimized for the creation of abundance. And this then provides us a way to enter, not necessarily yelling at people, but producing and helping everyone get back to that space. And I'll just close, to me, that indigenous does not mean brown people. It means the space of being, to me, is continuity. And sort of my mentors, Dr. Manu Meyer, talked about, like, you are indigenous to a place. Your genealogy and it comes from a place, and it speaks to a time in the human arc of development where we had strong ties to a geography and a group of people. And we learned how to live within the means of that. And we've traded some of that to participate in this new system. I'm not going to be all completely indicting it, because I'm talking to all of you on a computer. So the system optimizes for things. But what I think we're really interested in trying to figure out with my peers like Albie, who's been really vital in this work with me, is how do we recalibrate? And how do we recalibrate it back, but centering on equity for Indigenous people, not just because you have to, but because it makes the most sense for us as species. So hopefully that was helpful.
Liz, you want to go?
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Kamu. And it brings up a couple thoughts for me. And one is, I think a good foundational question for economic inquiry is, what do we value? And I think what I like about that question, especially when we ask it, in some kind of a community context with a group, is I think it helps us to acknowledge that value is produced socially, that these are decisions that we make together about what's being valued. It's not some abstract force of supply and demand or some invisible hand, that this is a social decision that's being made by us collectively about what we value. And so then I think it does, I totally agree with that idea of, what are we optimizing for? And that this is something that we decide through some kind of social process. So removing ourselves from being kind of objects to being subjects in this production of value, and really that we are actively producing what is being valued and what is not being valued. And I think the other thing that is really striking me as I'm listening to Kamu is that the food system that I'm hearing described is one that's about mutual flourishing in a place, sustained mutual flourishing in a place. And that's really different than designing a food system that's supposed to produce something to export or accumulate something that can then be exported over time. And those are two entirely different ways to construct an economy, and they have really different implications for everything we're talking about around justice and sustainability. And I think sometimes in discussions about economics, we're not explicit about which of those things is the goal.
So I'm going to approach this question in a slightly different way, because I think there's some important kind of premises that need to be addressed. And one is this idea that the current system is efficient and necessary. And this is something that I've spent a lot of time studying and have written with Liz and our colleague Marcia DeLong about, and that is, the current approach to industrial agriculture has been incredibly effective in terms of increasing, per acre yield and theoretically increasing the amount of food that's available on a per capita basis. But very problematically is, despite the increases in, yield, we have not solved for the problem of hunger, because the problem of hunger is one of poverty. It's one of access, it's one of entitlements. So we're never going to be able to solve for the problem of if our food system is designed to actually nourish people, and that raises this kind of fundamental question that Kamu and Liz are addressing. But if we're to try to feed people, then we need to approach it differently. And our colleges of agriculture and our international research apparatus has been overwhelmingly dedicated to this idea of increasing the productivity of staple commodities, despite the fact that we currently overproduce those commodities, and they're being channeled into the industrial food sector, food processing industry, and then end up in low-income communities of color, and those things are driving chronic illness. So we've been very successful at industrializing agriculture, pursuing this economic efficiency model. We've achieved that through biological simplification of agricultural ecosystems. That's driving a profound degradation of the capacity of agri-ecosystems to deliver ecosystem services that are globally important. So all these ecological externalities are now mounting, and that literature is irrefutable at this point. And we're not accounting for that cost. And for example, that cost is significant if you look at such things as 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions is coming from the food and agricultural space. That the materials that we're using to produce food are known or suspected carcinogens, endocrine disrupting compounds, and acute nerve toxins that are in certain communities causing cognitive development problems in children. So these are all profound externalities of the current system while it's still not actually feeding people. And so I think that those are really important elements that we have to bring into this conversation, as if the food system and agriculture is designed to actually feed people, we're not succeeding. At the same time, we're undermining the natural resource base upon which agricultural productivity and food security, human health and well-being depends. That's a very expensive model of agriculture, right? It may be producing cheap food that we can get at a drive-through window, but in the long term, it's incredibly expensive. And if we begin to actually tabulate what is the cost of reduced cognitive abilities of children, what is the cost of that level of greenhouse gas emissions, marine ecosystem eutrophication, the list goes on, then that food is not cheap at all, especially when you have 1 billion plus people who are either food insecure or malnourished in one way or another. So I think, that as kind of context, I think it's also important to point out, and this is where Liz and I have contributed to the literature along with our colleagues at Berkeley, is we have alternatives. The alternatives are absolutely clear, and some of the references that were thrown into the chat illustrate this, is we know that biologically diversified farming systems, if well designed using the science of agroecology to partition biodiversity in space and time in complementary ways, if we do that intelligently and draw upon traditional ecological knowledge to help us do that, then we can create highly productive agri-ecosystems that minimize externalities, enhance a range of ecosystem services, and produce the same quantities in terms of yield. However, because of the political economy of modern agriculture and the industrial capture of the political process, we have people like Sonny Perdue, a former fertilizer salesman, previously running the US Department of Agriculture. So, there is a conflict of interest in terms of how the political apparatus is being managed. Again, we have the alternatives at hand. The science is clear, it's robust, and it's simply a matter of I think, wrenching the political power from those who have vested interests in maintaining the status quo to help us transition to not only ecologically sustainable agricultural systems, but those that actually nourish people and restore environmental quality. So I'll pause there.
Yes, all great points. And as Regina just wrote in the chat, these all really enforce some of the key principles of ecological economics, which is thinking about economies that are at a sustainable scale, that distribute resources in a just manner, and then efficiently allocate those resources as well. And yes, I think all of what what you just talked about was this idea, not just of at like an individual producer level, but in the aggregate, thinking about challenging the dominant discourse of eternal growth and the pursuit of eternal growth economically, and what that means for our ecosystems. But before I want to ask one more question, because I'm looking at the time, and I want to give our webinar attendees a chance to ask some questions as well. So I want to piggyback off of what Albie said at the end of his response just now, and spin this forward to think about what we could be doing differently. And one of the reasons we wanted all three of you to come on was because of your work in sustainable agriculture. And one way, at least from my own perspective and my own work, that I think about the idea of sustainable agriculture broadly, however you want to define it, is in many ways pushing back against this idea of individualism, and that we see so much throughout, particularly the global north, and in many of our in our political and economic systems, and towards an idea of seeing codependency within our natural systems and our social systems, right? So the idea that our social systems are not these one-way or simplistic relationships, and understanding how to foster that codependency in a way that can build abundance for communities across the globe. And I think there's a useful metaphor there in thinking about the ways in which we've treated many communities of color and indigenous communities historically, and how we've marginalized not just their material conditions, but marginalized their ways of living, their ways of knowing and understanding, and rethinking about how we can recenter those perspectives and give communities real agency to determine the conditions of their own lives. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how you've seen that occurring, or envision that occurring in the work that you've been doing.
Albie, you want to go?
Go for it, Kamal.
I think important thing to incept at this point is, again, rugged individualism in pre-contact society would have got you killed, because you couldn't do things by yourself. Either you would have starved to death, or someone had just said, no, that's not yours, smash. I think what we had was rugged collectivism, and that horizontal type of dependence on each other is critical. And the key thing that's fundamental for many indigenous people is that the land and youth. And that's the core principles in what the organization I came from in Ma'o. If you're not focusing on the land's regenerative capacity and engaging the next generation in being in that space, none of this matters. You're just going to have it be decentered out someplace else. So I think for me, the work of engaging young adults in growing their food, not just as growing food, but the restoration of agency, and that their agency and their leadership is based off of their relationship with each other and the land around them. That's not a Hawaiian thing, that's an everybody thing. But the cool thing about Hawaii is that we have models, and we have really important ways that we've deployed that actually hit contemporary metrics, which is the second part of it. It needs to be able to shift dials. So at Ma'o, for example, what we tracked on a daily basis was sales and GPAs, the sales of product and the GPAs of students. And it put the community back in a table of signing college diplomas and signing paychecks. And when you're doing that in English, you're a very different organization. And that's how we leverage it out. So this focus on youth and land, and from Native Hawaiian perspective, the collectivism includes land and people, where we understood land was a sentient ancestor, not an inert thing that we could just pound. and that with that basis of investing in leadership of young adults to learn this model as a way for it to be totally applicable to how they survive in contemporary society. That to me is the core dynamic at play. And I look in the chat, I mean, in the view, I see some people who are doing that, like Michaela, she came out to Hawaii and spent time with us. I think that's a real, for me, important way to ground the conversation. So it's the true north is set.
Do you want to go?
Yeah. I think something that really struck me in the first project that I worked on as a graduate student with farmers in Montana, it's interesting that you bring in this term rugged individualism, because that came up a lot. And what I heard from people is that was really the narrative they were drawing on in sort of getting up the gumption to buck the corporate industrial agribusiness complex, So they were sort of embedded in these social systems that reinforced a lot of violence, sometimes that they could feel themselves, and in other ways that they were aware was impacting people at a distance. Again, whether you're talking about eutrophication or people who were facing oppressive working conditions somewhere else so that they could have goods or things like that. And so people sort of started being like, I'm going to be an organic farmer and I'm going to get out of these commodity markets from this place of rugged individualism. And then in that process of trying to figure out how can my agro-ecosystem support itself without chemical fertilizer and without chemical herbicides, and how can I stay in business without selling to the grain elevator? How can I create a market, which is to say relationships with people who are going to eat this stuff? Then people came into, particularly in looking at their plants as they started more complex rotations, learning from indigenous systems where legumes would be integrated with grains. I felt like what I heard from people is they kind of had this aha moment, like, I need to behave more like a lentil, like I'm going to help gather resources, but then I'm going to share them, through this sort of rhizosphere, right? That I'm going to have this shared basis of my life, that's what's going to make things possible, that the only flourishing really is mutual. And I imagine that we might see a lot of transitions that look like that, where you're sort of breaking with one set of relationships that reinforce oppressive conditions. And so maybe there's a moment where you see yourself as like this rugged individual, but then you're actually then breaking that model too and realizing actually it's a reweaving that needs to happen here of something collective.
I think I would approach this in a couple of ways. I think we're starting to see this in kind of surprisingly in the national discourse. And Philip, you mentioned this about one element of the federal stimulus plan is actually restorative justice, right? Returning lost income, lost wealth to those who were discriminated against. And I think that that's really foundational. If we're going to talk about social equity in the food system, I think we have to start with a conversation and actual meaningful steps around reparations, around the restoration of traditional foodways and compensating for people for past harms. That's the norm in modern industrial capitalist society, but certain people are not on the receiving end of being compensated for past harms. And so I think that that's really a foundational move, and I'm excited to see that that's actually gaining traction at the federal level. I think part of that includes, land redistribution for those people who have been dispossessed, whether that's something that's done at the federal level or the state level. Here in Hawaii, there is a form of land redistribution, but it's, I don't want to speak for the Hawaiian people in any way, but Kamo could comment on this, is I think that it's really not fully served the Hawaiian people. So, land reform and reparations for the dispossessed. And then, at a kind of a managing the capitalist system level, if we're going to even make small steps in addressing some of the social and ecological externalities at a very broad level, and Liz and I have written about this, we need to create a new system where the the current model of industrial agriculture that we know is generating all these social and ecological externalities, that begins to be disincentivized through a range of taxes, regulations, and so forth, including antitrust legislation that actually imposes some controls on consolidation in the agri-food industry, and then rechanneling some of those financial and other assets to supporting more biologically based and diversified farming systems so that people can be economically viable doing knowledge and time-intensive forms of diversified agriculture that serves their local or regional communities. Because right now we have kind of a race to the bottom approach to how we produce food. Those who externalize the greatest amount of social and ecological costs win. And we do have the organic certification and standards and so forth, but then that has also created a price premium, and it places some people outside of being able to afford those foods. So we need to do a number of things, I think, simultaneously: disincentivize destructive practices, incentivize regenerative practices, and make sure that all people at all times have either the entitlements in place or the revenue available, the purchasing power to afford the foods that are produced in their regional communities, so that they can gain access to not only adequate amounts of food, but adequate amounts of food that are culturally appropriate for them. So I'll pause there.
That's all fantastic and really great responses from you all. I know we are about at time. There are a couple of questions in the chat if you have just a moment to take one or two. But if not, we definitely thank you all for being here today and for making this a really great panel.
Thank you.
And so one question that we have, if you have time, is we know that disasters can be shocks that are opportunities for system change, but they can also be opportunities for disaster capitalism to entrench and deepen existing inequalities, to acceleration of the accumulation of wealth into the hands of the elites. In what ways are you seeing each of these reactions to the pandemic in terms of our food systems? And if you have specific examples, that would be great.
Kamo, Liz, you want to go?
Maybe I'll just jump in on, one transformational possibility that I see, and this has come up a couple times, is the legislation around repair of harms to farmers of color. So starting with $5 billion in this 1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, $4 billion of which is debt relief for farmers of color, and an additional $1 billion that's around land acquisition, technical assistance, and is also available for forming cooperatives. But then that's part of a much larger proposal that's on the table, a bill that Cory Booker and others worked on that includes something called an Equitable Land Access Service that would provide land grants of up to 160 acres for farmers of color that would be linked to all those other things that, the technical assistance, the financing, all of the things that people were illegally discriminated against in the past. And the Pigford lawsuit is sort of one of the ways we know about that, but there's so much more where that came from. So I think that's one example where there could be transformational change in the wake of the pandemic. But I think not just related to the pandemic. I think it's impossible for me to decouple how the pandemic is transforming the way people are thinking and how this moment of racial reckoning is transforming the way people are thinking. I think those two things have come together and helped create political momentum to push those two proposals forward. One is already passed, the other one is on the table.
Tamu? I'm going to go? Okay. I'm going to say two things, and this may be relevant or not. But I think that one of the things that, I've been reading Philip McMichael and kind of understanding that historical analysis. I threw that into the chat. And then moving to Hawaii and coming to understand that Hawaii imports an overwhelming majority of its food. We have somewhere between a 5 to 7 day supply of food in state at any time if the Port of Honolulu closes. And we don't have much of a plan. The official plan of the state of Hawaii is you are on your own, meaning you should have a 14-day supply of food and water at any given time, because if the Port of Honolulu closes, then we have that about 5 to 7 days supply of food. And and I wrote about this, and people from our emergency management agencies have written about this, is that we need to be better prepared for the inevitability of some type of natural or human-caused disaster. And I think COVID-19 was a bit of a wake-up call, is that we saw a shock to the system. And fortunately, with all due respect to those who got sick and lost their lives, is that was relatively easy because we didn't lose all of our infrastructure. There weren't mass casualties. The Port of Honolulu wasn't closed. It was an economic shock. But at any point, and we had Hurricane Douglas most recently, before that Hurricane Lane, and our emergency management professionals say that if either of those would have gotten much closer to Hawaii, then Hawaii would have looked like Puerto Rico. And we don't really have much of a sophisticated plan to ensure resilience and equity now, much less in times of crisis. And so that's kind of the work that I'm been focusing on most recently, and trying to bring people together to begin solving for some of the pre-existing problems, but also anticipating that there's going to be future shocks to the system. So I'll pause there.
I'll just add minimally that, part of what this provides is an opportunity, if you understand design thinking, to get to the mental model. Because I think when you have these shocks to the system, it really points out that the system has the shortcomings and gaps, and it creates this political will driven by community anger to do something about it. And the beauty of these moments, like you understand the notion of blessed unrest, is that we can engage. And in so much of, I'm always pulling from the ancestral frameworks I was raised in pre-contact Hawaiian society, there's a notion that we called hulihia, which was the turning or the shifting. And we ascribed that to one of our deities who was revered because she was disruptive. And her Pele and her sister Hi'iaka followed her and created the abundance after these disruptive forces passed through. So we didn't go into shock when disruption happened. Our system had built-in resilience. So incepting that mental model there then lifts up community-driven responses, not just community as the helpless actors in this, but the agents of change. So it can provides it in the thin edge of the wedge for the systems we've already been building to enter the dominant mental model and shift it. And the more we can leverage that for them asking us to be at the table, instead of us guilting them to have to be at the table, I think the more we get opportunities for authentic collaboration that is equity-rooted. And I do want to acknowledge Monique Marinesco put in the chat as one of the thought leaders at UH West Oahu alongside with Albie many years ago, who's been holding this space, and it's really nice to see you, Monique, and thank you for all the brilliant work that you've done.
Awesome. So I know we are several minutes over now, so I don't want to hold anyone too much longer. There are a couple of questions in the chat. If anyone wants to type in a quick answer as we wrap up. There is one question about resources for someone who's just starting to get into alternative models beyond the neoclassical economics that we often learn about in the classroom. There was another question here about if there's any recently introduced policies that introduce some form of price quotas or controls. And then another question around how much funding currently at the universities, at land-grant institutions, are currently being allocated to agroecological or regenerative farming. So just a few quick questions there. I know we are over time, but as we wrap up, if anyone wants to, if any of you have any quick closing thoughts that you maybe want to throw in either into the chat or out for everyone, this would be a great time to do that, right, just as we close.
Albie and I had the pleasure of wading into an incredibly opaque USDA database some years ago to try to answer that question you just articulated about what percentage of the funding was going where. And our best attempt at that, I'll drop a link to that. We published a paper a few years ago.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. Because as opposed to conventional methods and new technological fixes, which I'm assuming gets the bulk of the research funding. So, but I wanted, if you had numbers, that would be awesome. Thank you. Because we're going to be presenting to some of our Washington state senators and actually our senators in Congress. These are federal representatives and our House representatives as well. We're going to be giving a presentation on ag-related climate bills. And some of these, there are a few gaps in the knowledge here. And the other thing was the whole, parity pricing. I didn't see in any of the 4 that we're going to be presenting. There are 4 major ones, but I didn't see any reference to parity pricing, price floors, or supply management. But I didn't know if you know about that. If anybody knows.
I just wanted to note that I dropped in the chat the name of an organization called PUA Hawaii. And I think it's important to talk about sustainable ag, and you also have from indigenous people talk about subsistence practice. And that is an ancestral economic system. You didn't, the economy wasn't extractive, it was regenerative, and they managed the landscape like an endowment, where they knew the corpus of how much existed there, who had to eat, so that was the interest. So they never crashed the principle and called yourself rich, they would kill you. And KUA Network is a network of practitioners of Native Hawaiians across the state of Hawaii. We're holding on to these land-based practice. So it articulates how community-derived organizing can then impact policy and framework. And they're part of the network that Albie is mentioning. We talked about the work that we're doing in transforming our food system. It's a great way to think about indigenous economics as a primer to those out there. And so I just wanted to put that in the chat as well.
Thank you for sharing that. And I see some of the links being thrown in the chat. And what we'll do is we'll figure out a way to get these resources linked up with the webinar once we get it posted online. So for anyone who wants to check out these resources afterwards, you'll have an opportunity to do that. But with that, and looking at the time, I want to thank all of our panelists again, Liz, Albie, and Kamu again for joining us today, and for even giving us a little bit more of your time than you agreed to. This has been a great webinar, and thank you everyone for attending, and have a great weekend.
Aloha mai kako. Mahalo everybody, and thank you, Philip, for the wonderful moderation.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Aloha.
Thank you.
Okay, Liz.
Good to see everyone.